the Beverly Hillbillies, the wonders of the deep. The morning sun rose over the sprawling estate of the Clampett family, casting a golden glow on the manicured lawns that seemed a world away from the hills of Tennessee. Near the back of the mansion, Jethro Bodine was crouched on all fours, his eyes fixed intently on Duke, the family's aging bloodhound. With a look of profound concentration, Jethro picked up a small wooden branch and waved it in front of the dog's nose. He spoke with the patience of a man who believed that education was a marathon, not a sprint, telling the dog to watch closely because he was going to show him one more time how to fetch a stick. Ellie Mae walked onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and looking at her cousin with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. She asked Jethro if he could not do that out back, explaining that Mark was coming by, and she did not want him to see Jethro crawling around like a nut. Jethro took offense at the description, demanding to know who she was calling a nut. Ellie Mae pointed directly at him, noting that he had been trying to teach that dog to fetch a stick for 10 years. Jethro defended his progress, stating that such things take time, and arguing that Duke simply was not as bright as he was. At that moment, Jed Clampett stepped out into the yard, observing the scene with his usual calm demeanor. He asked what the young one was doing, and Jethro proudly repeated that he was learning Duke to fetch a stick while expressing his concern about Mark's arrival. Jed told him not to worry and knelt down beside the dog. He told the old hound he had something a lot better than fetching sticks and produced a nice juicy bone. Duke immediately sprang to life, wagging his tail and following Jed toward the rear of the house. Jethro watched them go, feeling slighted by the dog's sudden burst of energy. He remarked that it was an odd dog and noted how he did all the tricks, while the dumb old hound dog got the reward. Jed suggested that Jethro take Duke around back and share the bone with him, but Jethro recoiled at the idea. He asked his uncle if he really expected him to gnaw on the same bone with an old hound dog, calling the suggestion unsanitary. Ellie Mae agreed with Jethro, though her concern was for the dog, remarking that Duke might catch something from Jethro. Jethro and Duke made themselves scarce, just as Mark Templeton arrived. Jed greeted the young man warmly, but Ellie Mae noticed Duke finally picking up the stick as he followed Jethro away. Jethro was ecstatic, shouting to Uncle Jed that the dog had finally done it. Jed remarked that Duke was probably taking the stick around back, so Jethro could fetch it for him some more, as the dog seemed to like that arrangement. After the excitement settled, Jed pulled Mark aside for a word of caution. He warned him not to say anything to Granny about going in the water or making Ellie Mae into a frogwoman because it completely set her off. Mark nodded, explaining that he thought he had a way to win her over. He believed that if Granny could ever see the fascinating world that lies under the surface of the ocean, she would change her mind. Jed was skeptical, stating that nobody was going to get that little woman under the water. Mark clarified that he had brought a projector, a screen, and some underwater film to show her the wonders of the deep. Jed began to see the logic, though he still looked worried. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by Granny's voice. She was shouting for someone to let her go, declaring that she was not going to the bottom of any ocean. Mark tried to reassure her that he was only taking her there on film, but Granny was having none of it. She screamed for help, calling for Ellie Mae and claiming that Mark was going to drown her. Ellie Mae rushed over, explaining that Mark was just going to show her a movie. Granny's mood shifted instantly at the mention of a movie, asking if it was a Western since she loved cowboy pictures. Mark admitted it was not exactly a cowboy picture, but he encouraged them all to sit down and watch together. As the film began, Jed commented on how interesting it must be to explore under the sea. Mark explained that it was not only interesting but necessary for the survival of the human race, as humans would eventually have to farm the sea to feed the people of the earth. Granny looked at the screen with deep suspicion, comparing the beautiful underwater scenery to the time the creek rose and flooded the potato patch. When Mark mentioned farming the sea, Granny remarked that they would certainly have rusty plows. She pointed at a manta ray, claiming it looked like an underwater bat, and dismissed the colorful fish by saying they only looked good in a skillet. Mark tried to explain that many scientists believe humans originally came from the sea, but Granny firmly replied that the only sea she came from was Tennessee. Ellie Mae was captivated by the footage, expressing a desire to see it for herself, which only made Granny more stubborn. Granny told Mark to give up this frogman nonsense and be a range-riding, calf-roping, dust-kicking cowboy who raised babies instead of guppies. Jed whispered to Mark that Granny was set in her ways and that one could plant that little woman and grow 10 acres of stubborn. Later that morning at the bank, Milton Drysdale was frantically preparing his office. Miss Jane Hathaway entered and asked what all the decorations were for. Drysdale explained that he wanted to impress Lieutenant Mark Templeton because if the young man married Ellie Mae, he would control $40 or $50 million. Miss Jane reminded him that the first time Mark visited, Drysdale had thrown him out. Drysdale brushed this off as the natural resentment of a lowly sailor toward an officer, claiming that to Mark, he was now Spunky Drysdale of the United States Navy. He began walking with a limp, claiming it was a shark bite. Miss Jane was incredulous, but Drysdale insisted she treat the office like a ship. He gave her a whistle and a Navy hat, telling her to keep everything shipshape while he waited for the skipper. When Mark arrived at the bank, he was surprised to see Drysdale in full naval gear. Drysdale played the part of a battle-hardened veteran, spinning tales of character, integrity, and courage. He asked about Ellie Mae and Jed, reminding Mark that Jed kept his entire fortune in the bank because it had the strength of a battleship. Mark mentioned that Jed was considering taking $40 or $50 million to donate to oceanography research. The news caused Drysdale to drop his naval persona instantly. He screamed that the idea was stupid and insane, yelling for Miss Jane to throw Mark over the side. He ordered her to lock Mark in a brig and throw away the key, calling him a maniac for wanting to put $50 million in the ocean. Back at the mansion, Drysdale met with Granny to plot against the union of Mark and Ellie Mae. He told her that Mark was as nutty as a fruitcake. Granny agreed, calling Mark a frog brain. They decided to enlist the help of Dr. Klingner, a psychiatrist who shared an office building with Drysdale. Granny believed the doctor was a wizard who could change Mark back from his froggy ways. Meanwhile, Jed, Ellie Mae, Jethro, and Mark were at the swimming pool for another scuba lesson. Jethro had just finished eating 24 pizzas along with spaghetti, meatballs, and several other dishes. When they began diving, Granny watched from a distance, convinced they were all turning into frogs. She saw 4 figures in the water and assumed the smallest one was a neighborhood kid who had joined them. Drysdale and Granny eventually brought the group to see Dr. Klingner. The doctor, an enthusiast of scuba diving himself, decided to help Granny overcome her aquaphobia by giving her a personal demonstration. He put on his gear and dove into the pool while Granny was not looking. When Granny arrived at the poolside, she saw a large frog sitting on the edge where the doctor had been. She began talking to the frog, apologizing that she could not stop him from turning. She told the frog that his pretty secretary would be heartbroken to see him hopping in like that. Granny gently placed the frog in a sack and took it to the doctor's office to find Miss Jane. In the office, Granny met a woman who revealed she was actually Dr. Klingner's wife. Granny offered her condolences, explaining that her husband had suffered the worst part of their wedding vows. She opened the sack and showed the woman the frog, claiming it was George M. Klingner, Jr. The wife played along, and Granny suggested a cure based on old fairy tales. She told the woman to pick up the frog and kiss it, promising to leave so it would not be embarrassing. Granny departed, praying for a miracle. A moment later, the real Dr. Klingner walked in, perfectly human and still in his diving suit. His wife looked at the frog in the jar and then at her husband, laughing as she realized the extent of Granny's colorful imagination. As the day came to an end, the Clampett family gathered together, thankful for their hospitality and the strange, wonderful adventures that seemed to follow them wherever they went.